Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video and the next couple of videos, we're going to be discussing best practices for advanced strengthening of the core muscles. And we're going to be dividing it up into the three major planes that the anterior and lateral core muscles operate in, and those are the sagittal plane, the coronal, also known as the frontal plane, and the transverse plane, and this happens to be over the sagittal plane. So let's get started. Now, before we get too deep into talking about the specific exercises for strengthening the core muscles in the various planes of motion, I think it's important to discuss some very critical training principles that really govern which exercises are best and really understanding strengthening the core in general. And the first of these principles is this: you cannot isolate any of the core muscles. You cannot isolate the rectus abdominis, you cannot isolate the parts of the obliques, you cannot isolate the deep core muscles, aka the transversus abdominis. So I know you have to take EMG studies with a grain of salt, but what we found is that any given core muscle-based movement, like a sit-up, a crunch, a side bend, rotation, etc., against resistance, gets all four of the core muscles going. All four core muscles activate together. You cannot isolate any of them. There usually, however, are one or two muscles that predominate. But it's not always intuitive which of those muscles predominate. For example, we would expect, based on the actions of the muscles, that if we do a sagittal plane motion, like a sit-up type of movement, that the rectus abdominis would predominate. And in some of them, yes, it does. But in others, like the hanging knee up, which is certainly occurring in the sagittal plane, the rectus abdominis does not predominate. It certainly activates, but it's actually the oblique muscles that predominate, and this is based off of EMG studies that I've talked about in other videos. So the bottom line is, you can't isolate any of these muscles, and there's usually one or two that predominate, but it's not always intuitive. And so we can't just say, oh, we're doing a sit-up type of movement, so this is getting rectus abdominis. Can't say that. So what we usually talk about are strengthening the various planes of motion, okay? And as long as you're hitting all of the planes of motion, you are getting adequate strengthening and activation and hypertrophy of all the various core muscles, okay? So that's principle number one. The second principle is this, and I cover this in a lot more detail in other videos. When we talk about core stability exercises, core stability being isometric exercises of the core, like your Palloff press, any plank variation, farmer, suitcase carries, any of these isometric exercises, these core stability exercises, these for strength and hypertrophy are inferior to any of these exercises we're going to be talking about that takes the lumbar spine through a full range of motion against resistance, okay? What we know from pretty much any study is that isometric contractions are inferior to concentric and eccentric, which typically occur together. They're inferior for building pretty much any measurable parameter in skeletal muscle, whether it be size, strength, power, endurance, etc. If we want to improve those things, we need to be moving that part of the body through a full range of motion against resistance. And that's what these exercises we're going to be talking about here do. The third is a series of things, okay? And some of them we've already hit on a little bit. What constitutes a good exercise that we can select, okay? So number 3, part A, if you were keeping track like that, is we want the exercise to move that area of the body, those joints, through a full range of motion, okay? Obviously, core stability exercises don't use any range of motion of the lumbar spine, so they automatically fail in this first test, okay? Full range of motion. Part B is we want to get a stretch on the target muscle at some point in the movement, okay? That means when we're moving through the range of motion, we want that muscle to be stretched as much as possible, okay? Number 3, we want that exercise to be easy to progressively overload. Not all exercises are easy to progressively overload. A sit-up or a crunch, kind of difficult to progressively overload, especially through a full range of motion. And number 4, we want the point of maximum stretch on the muscle, if possible, to also coincide with the position of peak tension on the muscle during that exercise, okay? And we'll actually see a few of them in this video that actually satisfy all 4 of those, okay? So if you can satisfy all 4 of these principles right here, it's probably going to be a really good exercise for strengthening and getting hypertrophy out of that muscle, okay? And without further ado, let's get right into those exercises. Now, the first exercise I have listed here is just an honorable mention. Some people might be like, oh, I thought that was a really good core exercise. It's not a bad core exercise, don't get me wrong, but there are certainly better ones if you're looking for more bang for your buck for the core. And that's why the hanging knee up or the hanging leg up, depending, is just an honorable mention. Now, a hanging knee up, you can see here on the left side of the screen, this is where the knees remain bent, and it's a little bit easier, actually quite a bit easier if you ask me. And the hanging leg up, the knees are more straight, and sometimes you might even bring your toes up to the bar. You can do this exercise in a multitude of ways. You can literally just support yourself at a dip station and do this, or you can hang from a pull-up bar. Either way will accomplish it. But this exercise, I don't like it as much because it has 2 big pitfalls, okay? Actually 3, technically. Number 1 is you don't really get that much of a stretch on the core muscles at the bottom of the movement. You kind of just get to the point where your lumbar spine is neutral, so there's not a very big stretch on it, okay? We can do better with the stretching aspect. Number 2 is this exercise is very difficult to progressively overload. I mean, you could put some ankle weights on the ankles, you could, hold a weight between your legs, but it's really not very convenient to progressively overload. And so what most people end up doing is just doing more and more repetitions, but again, there's bigger bang for your buck exercises. The third point where this exercise fails is that the point of maximum stretch does not coincide with the point of peak tension on the muscles. Maximum stretch occurs when the body is totally hanging. Everything's vertical. Your thighs, your legs point down towards the floor, okay, at the bottom of the movement. The point of peak tension occurs when the thighs are parallel to the floor at 90 degrees, okay? And since those points are opposite each other, while it's not a deal breaker for a lot of exercises, the fact that it's difficult to overload properly and with good form, and it doesn't really get that great of a stretch on the core muscles at the bottom, it's just an honorable mention. That being said, in no way am I going to say it's a bad exercise. I just think that if you're looking for the most bang for your buck, there are better ones, which leads us to the GHD machine. And the first 2 of these are very similar to each other. They're both GHD Situps. It's just that one is going to be a little bit better at targeting the lower rectus abdominis, and the second's going to be better at targeting the upper rectus abdominis. And the way that you differentiate those has to do with the buttock position relative to the pad on the GHD machine. So let's take a look at the first GHD sit-up variation. This is actually my favorite overall. Okay, it's not like it doesn't get the upper rectus abdominis, it gets the whole rectus abdominis. It's a lot better at hitting the lower fibers of it than the second variation, which we'll see in just a minute. The butt for this one is a little bit over the edge of the padding on the GHD machine, okay? This exercise really does check all 4 big boxes of what constitutes a good resistance exercise. So at the bottom of the movement, the eccentric part, you are getting into lumbar extension. That's not something that we're really getting in the hanging knee up type of exercise, okay? We're getting lumbar extension here, which does put a big stretch on the core muscles, in the front particularly, but a little bit on the sides too, but mainly in the front. We are getting a big stretch on the muscles. And better yet, that position of max stretch at the bottom where we're in that lumbar extension is pretty close to the position where we get peak tension on the muscles. So that's 3 boxes right there already checked, okay? It's also pretty easy to progressively overload. As you can see in this video clip right here, we're actually starting with the arms crossed. How can we progressively overload there? Well, there's 2 ways. Number 1 is you can just hold a weight. You can hold a weight in your arms across your chest. That's an easy way to progressively overload this lift. Another way, and this is actually a lot better of progressive overload than most people think, is just instead of crossing your arms here, take them up overhead or even partially overhead. but especially overhead. It's actually very humbling how much harder that makes this exercise. And if you really want to make this hard, take those positions like this and hold a weight there, which sometimes we call a GHD sit-up pullover, as you can see there on the little bullet points. And that makes this exercise incredibly difficult, and that's actually what you see right here in the clip. So all 4 boxes are checked there. This is a fantastic exercise, and if you've never done it, you really should try. First step, of course, is getting access to a GHD machine, which is not always a luxury, but in other videos, I will show you ways that you can actually get around that, a different setup, where you can have much less expensive equipment, or if you don't have a gym that has this, you can set this up on your own. Keep a watch for that video in the future. So GHD sit-ups. This variation targeted more the lower rectus abdominis, but how can we get a little better bias on the upper rectus abdominis? Well, all we do is we shift the position of the buttocks. So whereas in the lower rectus bias, we have the buttock on the other side, the outside, so to speak, of that GHD pad, for the upper rectus, we have it on the inside, closest to the foot anchors on the GHD pad. And so when you do this variation, this is going to get a lot more upper fibers of the rectus abdominis. And again, the same 4 boxes are checked here. Okay, it's a little more awkward of a movement, but you can progressively overload this in the same ways. Hold a weight on your chest. Put your arms up overhead. Hold a weight there. Same principles, okay? And particularly this one, this will give you a gnarly pump in the upper rectus abdominis, especially if you let it get to that max stretch position at the bottom and really drive using those upper core muscles there. Very good exercise. Most of the time, if I'm going to be doing any of these first 2, I'm going to be doing the first one, the lower rectus bias, a little more often, just because it does hit the whole thing. But if I'm going to vary between the 2, I'm going to do lower versus upper in a ratio of about 2-to-1. That's just my preference. Now a third one that utilizes the GHD machine, and that is the reverse sit-up on the GHD. So in this variation, which you can see right here, now I have my low back against the pad here. I'm holding on for dear life on the foot anchors there. And now we're doing the reverse motion. So whereas in the GHD sit-up normally, the legs are static and the torso is mobile, now we have a situation where the legs are mobile and the torso is static. And the only issue I have with this exercise is that it is difficult to progressively overload. You could do the whole ankle weight thing. You could hold something in between your legs. It's easier said than done. But that being said, this is actually a very, very difficult exercise. And so for that reason, I still find it extremely useful, especially if you're a big dude that has really big legs. Those legs are going to weigh you down a lot there and put a really big work on the core. So even though it doesn't satisfy the progressive overload box for that list of concepts, it does satisfy all the other 3. You're getting a big stretch on the muscles because you're getting a lot of lumbar extension at the bottom. And that position also corresponds to where you're getting peak tension on the muscle. And of course, you're moving through a full range of motion. It's really a fantastic exercise. Definitely give this one a try. Now, by this point in the video, you're probably sitting there like Jeff Goldblum in Independence Day. Enough with the GHD machine. You're obsessed with the GHD machine. And yes, I am obsessed with this machine because it is fantastic. That's why I have one in my house. I think every strength athlete and every athlete in general should probably invest in some kind of access to this machine, because not only is it great for the core, but depending on other exercises you do, it can be fantastic for glutes and hamstrings. It's really that good. We'll be talking about those in other videos. But like I said, enough with the GHD machine. I'm going to show you another exercise here that's also amazing for the core, and it's cable crunches. Now, the thing with cable crunches, which you can see right here in the video clip, now I'm not going to lie, I used to hate cable crunches, and I think the reason I hated them was because I really just couldn't feel them that much in my core, and I think it had to do with my setup, which was also due to not having the best pieces of equipment. So one thing that absolutely revolutionized how I do cable crunches is this strap right here that I'm actually using in the video, and I'm going to put a link to this on Amazon in the comment section of this video. This strap attachment is absolutely fantastic for cable crunches. It's also useful for a lot of exercises like field goal rows that I put in my external rotation video. Make sure to find that on my channel somewhere. So there's other uses for it too, but for cable crunches, this thing was a game changer. And so it allows me to really get my core going a lot better than just simply holding a bar or something in my hands. Now there's two big things that you want to make sure you're doing on cable crunches. Number one, you don't want your thighs to move. You want your thighs to basically remain vertical in the whole movement. There's a few instances here where they're moving a hair backwards posteriorly. That's okay. What you don't want is a large movement of the thighs backward. You want them to remain relatively constant in position, theoretically vertical, okay? The second thing is, where do I aim my elbows as I'm coming down? So you're not aiming towards the hips. You're not aiming towards the thighs. You're aiming toward the kneecaps. Now that being said, that doesn't mean your elbows actually have to touch your kneecaps. If you're actually able to get them to the kneecaps, you're probably using too little resistance, and you want to go up in resistance. But aim toward the kneecaps, and that's what's going to get you the best results on this exercise. Another important consideration is really control the eccentric back up and try to get maximum stretch in these muscles here. And if you do all those things, after you finish this exercise, you're going to have a gnarly pump in those core muscles. And because you're using a cable machine, this exercise is actually pretty easy to progressively overload. And if you happen to run out of weight on the cable machine, you probably need to get a cable machine with more resistance. But usually in most commercial gyms, that's pretty easy to find. And also, the heavier you are up top, the greater the starting weight's going to need to be on the cable machine. So just keep that in mind. Like a starting weight of 100 pounds for some people might actually be too little if you're big up top, but if you're a small person, 100 pounds might just knock you right back up. Okay, so the starting position depends on your body weight. Okay, so these 4 sagittal core exercises, absolutely phenomenal for building your sagittal core, especially in strength and size. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.